A few Scandinavian runestones mention people connected with Viking activity, yet none proclaims membership in a unified Viking nation. That measured absence narrows the meaning of a label now applied to millions of early medieval lives. During the period itself, Viking words usually concerned an activity, journey, or participant rather than an ethnicity. Modern usage has stretched the term across farmers, craftspeople, rulers, captives, migrants, and sailors who identified themselves differently. Recovering those identities requires a mosaic because no surviving source offers a complete Scandinavian map. Place names, law regions, burial customs, objects, inscriptions, and foreign accounts each illuminate separate layers. Together, they reveal communities linked by language and exchange, but divided by landscapes, loyalties, and local traditions. Family and household formed immediate identities for most people, embedded within farms and neighboring settlements. Obligations to kin could shape inheritance, marriage, vengeance, support, and access to land. These relationships were lived more regularly than any abstract membership in a Scandinavian world. Local districts organized assemblies and legal expectations whose later written forms preserve older elements unevenly. Because surviving law codes are medieval manuscripts, they cannot be treated as exact transcripts of 9th century practice. They nevertheless point toward regional jurisdictions that kingdoms later incorporated, negotiated with, or attempted to standardize. Landscape reinforced those divisions through mountains, firelands, fjords, watersheds, and variable agricultural zones. Travel connected regions, but the effort of travel also helped make locality meaningful. Eastern Scandinavia contained named lands that did not correspond neatly to the later Swedish state. Written sources refer to Svir and Gotar, while archaeological patterns reveal further distinctions within and beyond those broad terms. Swoland centered broadly upon the Mälar region, although its extent and political meaning changed over time. Gotland included western and eastern areas whose relationships with Svir cannot be reduced to one conquest story. Åland, Gotland, Jämtland, and other districts carried identities rooted in their own communities and contacts. The Swedish History Museum emphasizes that modern Sweden emerged much later from this diversity. Using Swedish for every Eastern Scandinavian in the Viking Age imports a state that did not yet exist. The same caution applies elsewhere. Although Danish and Norwegian names appear in early sources under changing political circumstances, Denmark developed powerful royal claims, especially during the 10th century, without erasing all Jutlandic or island differences. The Jelling inscription associated with Harald Bluetooth presents an ambitious royal statement about winning Denmark and Norway. As a monument, it expresses authority deliberately and should not be mistaken for a neutral administrative survey. Political unification was a project proclaimed by rulers, not proof that local identities immediately disappeared. Norway's long coast contained communities separated by difficult overland terrain and oriented toward distinct sea routes. Later sagas organize its unification around memorable kings, but those narratives were written generations afterward. Contemporary skaldic poetry and archaeology can support selected developments without validating every saga episode. Regional assemblies, aristocratic centers, and burial traditions indicate several bases of power before durable monarchy. Across these lands, material culture offers patterns rather than personal identity cards. Brooch styles, pottery, house forms, and burial rites could cluster geographically. Such distributions may reflect craft traditions, social signals, exchange zones, or ritual choices. They do not prove that every user named themselves after the region modern archaeologists map. Gotland provides an especially distinctive archaeological profile through picture stones, silver finds, graves, and maritime connections. Its inhabitants participated intensively in Baltic exchange while maintaining recognizable island traditions. That combination refutes the assumption that strong external contact dissolved regional difference. Objects from afar could be reinterpreted locally and become ingredients of a specifically Gotlandic display. On Åland, settlement forms and burial customs likewise followed trajectories not identical to the Mälar Valley. Western Scandinavian contacts influenced parts of present-day Western Sweden more strongly than Eastern styles did. Regional identity was therefore relational, defined partly through nearby partners and rivals rather than isolation. Burials make these contrasts visually compelling, but mortuary evidence requires disciplined caution. The dead were arranged by survivors according to choices involving status, memory, religion, age, and local convention. A furnished grave cannot reveal every identity its occupant held while living. Weapon burial does not automatically establish a lifelong warrior occupation. Imported jewelry may signal connection, imitation, inheritance, or exchange rather than foreign birthplace. Scientific analyses can sometimes add mobility or biological relationship to the mosaic. Strontium isotope measurements compare bodily tissues with environmental baselines, helping identify non-local childhood signatures in favorable cases. Ancient DNA can reveal genetic relationships or ancestry patterns among sampled remains. Neither method determines language, legal allegiance, ethnicity, or the name a person used. Movement itself could create new identities that crossed regional categories. Scandinavians settling in England, Ireland, Francia, or the Eastern Baltic entered societies with their own political vocabularies. In Normandy, descendants of Scandinavian settlers became Normans through adaptation, intermarriage, Christianity, and Frankish political life. Across the Irish Sea, communities combined Scandinavian and Gaelic cultural elements in changing circumstances. Archaeologists sometimes use Norse Gaelic as an analytical term, not a universal self-description securely recorded for each individual. Along Eastern routes, the term Rus carried meanings that varied by source, time, and social context. It could relate to groups involved in trade, warfare, rulership, or emerging polities containing many backgrounds. Calling every person within those networks a Swedish Viking collapses the very historical change requiring explanation. Northern Scandinavia adds another essential boundary to the modern label. Sámi communities maintained livelihoods, exchange systems, technologies, and cultural traditions distinct from neighboring Norse-speaking populations. Interaction included trade and probably unequal power, but the evidence varies by region and period. Later Norse texts use outsider terms that reflect their authors' perspectives rather than neutral ethnography. Archaeological classification must likewise avoid converting material differences into rigid ethnic borders. People could cross economic and cultural boundaries without abandoning every earlier attachment. Identity operated in layers that became more or less important depending upon circumstance. At home, a person might be known through kin, farm, district, legal standing, and patron. At a distant market, language, dress, cargo, or companions could produce broader categorization. A Frankish cleric observing raiders had little reason to record their home valley or assembly district. External chronicles consequently flattened diverse attackers into collective names useful to frightened or administrative audiences. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle often uses Danes or heathens within particular political and religious frames. Frankish annals employ labels shaped by imperial geography and diplomatic concerns. These texts remain valuable for events, but their categories cannot simply be carried back into Scandinavian self-understanding. Old Norse literature creates a different distortion because most manuscripts survive from later Icelandic and Norwegian contexts. Its rich Western vocabulary gives those regions a narrative visibility not matched across all Scandinavia. Eastern and Southern communities should not be reconstructed merely as quieter versions of Saga Iceland. Runic inscriptions offer contemporary local voices, though usually brief, formulaic, and socially selective ones. Many commemorate kin, property, travel, faith, or status, showing identities attached to relationships and actions. Some name lands or peoples, but inscriptional terminology still changes across time and context. No single evidence class can rank all these affiliations from strongest to weakest. The modern Viking label persists because it efficiently names a period, visual culture, and field of study. Used carefully, Viking Age marks a chronological framework whose boundaries vary by scholarly tradition. Used carelessly, Viking turns that framework into a supposed people with uniform beliefs and behavior. The difference affects how expansion, conversion, gender, slavery, and political formation are interpreted. A homogeneous Viking society makes regional change appear exceptional when variation was actually normal. It also hides people who never traveled overseas but sustained households, crafts, and local institutions. Captives brought into Scandinavia occupied legal and social positions that the heroic label obscures almost completely. Merchants arriving from beyond the region complicate any image of sealed ethnic communities. Christian converts and pre-Christian practitioners could live within the same political landscapes during uneven transitions. Religious affiliation added another identity without automatically replacing family or district ties. By the later Viking Age, expanding kingdoms promoted wider loyalties through monuments, coinage, law, churches, and military organization. The familiar label, therefore, covers a history in which identities were continually regrouped rather than suddenly standardized. The clearest conclusion is not that Viking should be prohibited in every historical sentence. Instead, its purpose must be specified whenever it shifts from activity to period, style, or population. A raider on a voyage, a farmer in Gotland, and a craft worker at Ribe shared a century, not necessarily one primary identity. Their connections mattered, but connection never required sameness. Behind the label stood districts, islands, kin groups, legal communities, religious affiliations, and mobile coalitions. Each layer could widen, contract, or acquire new meaning as rulers and migrants redrew relationships. The Runestones remain a fitting boundary because they name particular people through acts of remembrance. Their local words survive where the imagined voice of a single Viking nation does not.